Today, Magnus Carlsen is renowned for his positional wizardry, winning games that have no right to be won against the strongest competition. However, Magnus used to be renowned for his attacking play. When he was a young prodigy, he won many games with dazzling sacrifices and beautiful combinations. The following game was played when he was just 14 in the Norwegian Championship in 2005, and he plays a beautiful kingside attack that eventually turns into a king hunt. The game's opening is already a little bit unorthodox. The players reach a transposition to the queen's Indian defense, in which we get this interesting bishop a6 move. Now, after pawn to b3, there are thousands of games in this line, and it makes sense to play something like bishop to b4 or pawn to d5 in this position. However, the move b5 seems a little odd. We just played pawn to b6, and now we're going to play pawn to b5. This really constitutes a loss of time and should give white an extra edge in the opening. So white goes ahead and takes on b5, black captures back. It's important to note that a coming knight c3 is going to gain an extra tempo on this bishop, giving white a nice plus. Bishop g2, d5, castles, knight bd7, knight c3, and the bishop pulls back to a6. There's that tempo on the bishop we talked about just a moment ago. Rook e1 is played, and already pawn to e4 is considered in this position. So this looks to be pretty dangerous for black, but it's actually not that effective to continue aggressively from here. So after bishop d6, bishop b2, castles, white would actually do better playing a more modern Carlsen approach with, for example, the rook coming to c1. From c1, white has a good control over the c file, is attacking on that half open file and putting pressure on the backward c pawn. White's position should give a decent advantage, although the game is, still well underway. Instead, the younger Magnus plays for open lines with pawn e4, and I think already you can really see the contrast between his current style and his younger style with this move. After knight takes, pawn takes, rook takes e4, bishop b7, the prudent move would probably be to retreat with rook e1, although white does not have an advantage anymore after this. Instead, the younger Magnus played rook to h4, a move I think he is pretty unlikely to play even in a blitz or rapid game today, and I definitely don't think that after bishop e7 he would have continued with the rook to h3. This calls to mind Sergei Karyakin's rook h3 against Anand in a previous video we looked at, and we found that the rook ended up super offsides in that game. This example is probably even considerably worse because the rook is really trapped behind this g3 pawn, and white's attack, although it gets going in the game, really shouldn't lead to anything against good defense from black. Of course, good defense is difficult, and there are many things to still come in this game. Knight f6 is played, the queen moves to e2, bishop to d5, establishing the bishop in the center, rook e1. And now queen b8 is played, and this is probably a mistake. I want to let the opponent of Magnus speak from here. These are comments he made in an online forum, and they're really nice. He says, "Greetings from the player who lost this game, ! Smiley face. Indeed, I was shocked when Magnus played rook h4, and I can't remember ever seeing such a maneuver before. I remember he wasn't too satisfied by his own play after the game, and he thought the position would be equal if I had played a5 on this move instead of queen b8. After queen b8, it was a downhill struggle. Still, when I realized the position was lost, I was glad that it happened in such an entertaining way." Later in the thread, he commented, "A5 is a good move because it creates counterplay on the queen side. The plan is primarily to follow up with a4, after which either a2 or b3 will be weak. Furthermore, the rook on a8 will be well placed when the a file is opened up. Queen d8 to b8 to b7, which was what was played in the game, is positionally fine, but he goes on to say that it's basically too slow in this position." These are obviously fantastic comments from Carlsen's opponent in this game, who has obviously spent a lot of time looking at the game and is a great player. We should always remember that just because Magnus is now the world champion that his opponents are still great players in their own right. And that insight here, which also gives us some insight into what Magnus was thinking after the game, is really interesting. It's also really interesting to me that Magnus wasn't too happy with this game, and indeed the computer does point out a lot of improvements for black here, and the rook h4, rook h3 maneuver is pretty suspicious, but I think most of us would be pretty stoked to win the beautiful game that this is going to be. It's interesting that already at age 14, when he wins a beautiful game, he's still going to be critical if he doesn't feel like he played the best moves in a lot of cases. So, after rook e1, the game continues with queen b8. As the opponent says, this is a bit too slow. Knight e5 now happens, queen b7, and we get a trade on d5 here. Queen c2 is played, and this is starting to be pretty threatening. This is obviously a mating square here. If knight g4 is played, there is a threat to eliminate the knight on f6, and then there can be mate on h7. This is already the point at which black should have been defending. The move h6 in this position anticipates the idea of knight g4, and although there is the possibility of advancing with pawn g4 either on this move or maybe very soon, the attack is not sufficient to overwhelm black against good defense. Instead, c5, which is a very logical move, was played in the game, and it's already very, very dangerous for black. The basic problem, I think, is that black is trying to break apart the center, which is strategically the right thing to do. When your opponent is engaging in a kind of wing attack, which certainly is happening with the rook on h3, and white's trying to attack like h7, you want to try and strike in the center. Good strategy. The problem is, while you're sitting here with the rooks completely uninvolved in the defense or in pressuring the center, and white's pieces are all somewhat involved in this attack, then you're going to struggle with a move like c5. It's too slow. You don't have enough pieces there to support it. You need to be thinking more prophylactically. Knight g4 now happens, supernatural. We're trying to eliminate the knight on f6 and mate on h7. h6 is now played to cover that mate on h7. Rook e5 comes very, very natural. We're going to gain tempo on the queen and improve our rook's position. The queen tries to stay active, attacking this knight here on g4 and hoping that the knight will exchange itself for the knight on f6. When bishop recaptures on f6, will help us out, and we will be able to defend successfully from there, ideally. Instead, it's time to put on our thinking caps, pause the video, and figure out what Magnus played from this position. So at this point, knight takes h6 is a tremendous and winning sacrifice. After knight takes h6, pawn takes h6, rook takes h6, the threat is simply rook to g5, and it's going to be mate in 1. At the cost of a piece for 2 pawns, we've opened up the black king and created tremendous threats. Black's only got a few responses here, and the only really viable one is king to g7, trying to avoid rook g5 mate and threaten the rook on h6, forcing it back. Now, if the rook on h6 moves, then black has some chances to defend here, although the position's still very difficult. However, there is a knockout blow, and you should pause your video and try and figure out what Magnus did right here. So the winning move is rook g5 check, sacrificing the rook on h6. We follow up our knight sacrifice with the sacrifice of the rook on h6. And after king takes h6, you really need to have seen the next move to have any hope of justifying your sacrifice. Bishop c1, white is winning. I love this bishop move. It is a retreating move. It is said that it is very hard to see retreating diagonal moves. But in this position, we set up a tremendous array of discovered checks, and black simply can't defend against all of these threats. Tallaksen does find the best defense, but it is not enough. He captures on d4, and now after rook g4 check, he doesn't move his king with king h5 because rook h4 is simply a beautiful checkmate in 1 move. He gives back his queen with queen to e3. Now, if white picks up the queen, he'll lose the rook on h4, right? Because the knight is threatening the rook. So we need an intermediate check here. Rook to h4 check attacks the king and threatens to just grab the queen next move with an easily winning position. So black tries knight to h5, which again attacks the rook, this time with the bishop, which is of course very, very clever. At this point, the best move is rook takes h5 check, giving up the rook for the knight, still not taking the queen that is hanging on e3 to two different pieces. And after king takes, we have queen h7 check. We're holding off on capturing that queen, which is very tempting, right? To grab the queen, is the thing that we're dying to do, right? And instead, black, as our white Magnus Carlsen, is holding off, not taking the queen yet, so that he can get the most out of his advantage. It's now time to go grab the queen, though, and the king, through these intermediate moves, has been forced to g4, where it's basically in a mating net. After rook to c8, I'd again encourage you to pause your video and figure out what the best move is in this position. The winning move right here is king g2, another beautiful move. At this point, the game is completely over. The black king is basically getting checkmated unless black gives up a ton of material. Notice that it is not possible to play rook c2 check because the queen does cover c2. That's a very, very important detail in this position. Instead, lacking anything better, black goes ahead and takes on c1, but now the queen can force checkmate. h3 check pushes the king to g5, queen g7 check, and after the king goes to f5, we have g4 check, king to e4, only legal move, and queen takes d4, and checkmate against the king in the center of the board. This is a beautiful, beautiful game. It is not as good as some of Magnus Carlsen's more recent efforts, but I love it because it is such a vibrant game that demonstrates the aggression of youth. And I hope that at some point in the future, we might see Magnus play more games like this at the World Championship level. Certainly, other players have seen their game become more aggressive in a later stage, recalling, for example, their younger games in their youth, like Vladimir Kramnik, who was an attacking player in his youth and then became much more solid and later became aggressive again. Hopefully we see something like that from Magnus at some point in the future. If you like this game, please do subscribe and also check out the playlist that we have on king hunts and other amazing miniatures. Thank you so much and have a great day.